Happy Valentine's Day. Welcome back to Cake Decorating 101. Here's how to fill, stack, and decorate a vintage themed heart cake. You're gonna need a turntable, a non-slip mat, offset spatulas, I like to have a big and a small one, bench scrapers, and a cake drum. You're also gonna need some piping bags. My favorite way to fill a piping bag is to fold over the top of the piping bag while making a C shape with my hand. That way when I'm filling my piping bag with my buttercream, I can use my thumb to wipe off all of the excess, folding the top over, shaking all that buttercream down. Follow the seam of the piping bag and cut that top off. Make sure you're throwing that away. Alright, now we gotta level our cakes. I use this cake leveler. I personally like the one with the serrated level instead of the wire. I just feel like it's more stable. You can also use a serrated knife for this. Both of them get the job done. I'm just going ahead and leveling all of my cakes, placing the extra scraps in a bag. And then this is one of my favorite things to do. I personally don't like having this little crust when you cut open a cake. So I just take one of my cake layers, flip it upside down, and cut just that crust off with the serrated knife. And then when you cut that cake open at the end, it's gonna look like one seamless slice of cake. Okay, now that our cakes are all leveled, we're gonna start on our crumb coat. I'm gonna take my piping bag and squeeze at the utmost top part with my palm and put some buttercream on my cake board just so my cake layers don't slide while I'm decorating. And then I'm slowly gonna pipe a buttercream border around the edges of my cake so that none of that filling slips out while decorating. To make sure this border is even more secure, I take my small offset spatula and bring the edges of the bottom part in so that it's nice and safe tucked in. I'm gonna straighten out my sides a little bit and then go in with my filling. We're gonna fill this cake today with some Nutella. I'm literally just taking it with a spatula and putting it in the middle. You could also use a piping bag for this. I switch it off here and there. Sometimes I use a spatula, sometimes I use a piping bag. It just depends on my mood that day. And then I'm just taking another small offset spatula and smoothing that Nutella out. Put on our second layer of cake. I'm gonna slowly put that on there, making sure it's nice and even. Once you place on your second layer, you're gonna notice that your buttercream bulges a little bit. I just use that just to start my crumb coat process. And then I'm gonna do the same thing before adding my third layer on, create a buttercream border, bring those edges in, fill it in with Nutella, scrape the sides down, and pop my third layer of cake on. A crumb coat is essentially just us trapping all of those crumbs in, creating a more stable cake to frost later, and it just makes for an overall better product at the end. And then I pipe on some buttercream onto my cake and start smoothing it out and wiping that excess off in a separate bowl just to ensure none of those crumbs are in our final cake. And once that crumb coat's done, you're gonna pop that cake in the fridge for at least 30 minutes for the buttercream to set. Now it's time for our final coat of buttercream. You can either use a piping bag or plop on a bunch of buttercream at the top and start working it towards the sides. I like to start with a big spatula because it's easier for me to distribute all of my buttercream around, and it's also nice to smooth out the top with a big spatula. And then I like to go in with my small spatula just to fill in all those gaps and spread that buttercream out more. Once the buttercream's distributed, I'm going to take my bench scraper and keep it at a 90-degree angle, so one side's touching the board, one side's touching the cake so that it's not angled in any way, and start smoothing my cake. Once it's pretty smooth, I like to take my taller bench scraper and run it through some hot water just so that the bench scraper becomes warm, and then slowly start to smooth the sides of my cake. I love this technique. I feel like it gets rid of all the air bubbles and just melts that buttercream together to create a nice smooth side. And then I'm going to bring those edges in, and now we're ready to decorate. For this cake, we needed a pink and a red, so for the red, I used Chef Master's Super Red, and for the pink, I use one drop of the Satin Ice Pink. All right, now we start to pipe. I'm going to take my piping bag and run my fingers along the seam to create a nice little circle after I cut that top off. Practice on a paper towel and get started on writing on a cake. Now, writing on a cake is not easy. As you can see, it took me a bunch of tries, but all you're going to do if you mess up is scrape it off and then just smooth out some white buttercream back on that. It's all totally fixable no matter what